In this exercise, we are going to look at using the IMVU Toolkit to make clothing based on cloth simulation, so cloth sim. So it needs to be said right off the bat that whilst this emulates Marvelous Designer, it is not a replacement for Marvelous Designer. So with that out of the way, let's just get stuck in. As always, we need a clean scene, so File, New, General. This just ensures that we are starting from a scene that doesn't have any shenanigans going on. Make sure our cube, nothing is selected in the scene because the clothing file doesn't work otherwise. And then View, Sidebar. So there's a sidebar, there's a toolkit, and we want the clothing tool. So click on the heading and then click on Append Clothing File. So we get the avatar in place and we can select whichever version we want. So let's just go with the male, which is the old default. I'm going to save the project at this point. So File, Save As. Cloth Sim 1. Save As. Right, so we need to do two things, but we can do one of them right now. So the first thing, in order for this to work, we need to set up the avatar so that the simulation, the cloth sim, has something to work against, something that causes resistance to the cloth, that acts essentially as the collision object for the simulation. So we need to set that up. So select the avatar mesh, or meshes, depending on the clothing's design. So select the mesh. We want to go into physics. So physics properties, and we need to set this up as a collision object. Click that, and then the key properties to set are dampening and the thickness outer inner. Everything else can be left at the defaults. So we need to set dampening at 1, so click drag. Thickness outer, this will define the distance of our mesh when we get to it away from the avatar. So this is how far away the mesh sits on the mesh. So 0.2 is fine. Inner, we can change that to 0.1. And then friction, we can set that also. That determines how resistive the friction, how resistive the surface is to our simulation. So we can set that to 10. Again, these may vary depending on the avatar that you're using and the mesh density. So those are our basic settings. We need to replicate those to the other parts of the torso. So collision, that's okay. So that's 0.1, that's 10. Collision, 0.1, 10. Collision, 0.1, 10. And we could do it to the feet as well, just because, and the ankles. One, 10. And what this ensures is that the mesh will collide with the entire avatar. So without this, you can set it for the head as well. Without this, the mesh or the clothing item won't simulate correctly. So let's just save the file again. So file, save as, just creating version saves so we don't have to keep doing all that. So that's step 1. Step 2, we have to add our clothing mesh. So in this case, what we want to add mesh plane. So we're going to replicate essentially or emulate the way that Marvelous Designer works, because this system uses the same sort of metaphors that's in use for Marvelous Designer. So we're going to add a plane that will appear down at the cursor, which is at the feet of the avatar. Just rotate. I'm going to position this roughly where it needs to be. And then what we need to do here is do some basic shaping of this mesh object so that it fits over our avatar. So I'm going to quickly go into View, Viewpoint, Front. So those are our numpad keys, 1, 3, 5 and 7 the main ones. So View, Viewpoint, Front. And then we'll do some basic editing. So edit mode. We'll switch to wireframe so that we can see the torso underneath, and then we'll do some basic editing. So we can use the tools, so loop cut, or just use the shortcut key, which is Control R. And what we want to do, in a similar way to creating clothing, is just make a simple mesh, simple structure that's not too detailed. And this will give us enough structure for us to work with to create a basic shape. So we can toggle into solid mode, object properties, and enable viewport display, wireframe. And that will mean that we can see our wireframe in object mode. So we want to do some basic shaping. So that's Alt click to select the loop. And then we can use the tool to get the shape that we want. So that's going to be our basic shape. What we can do here is use the mirror modifier. So we're going to delete half of the mesh. Delete. And then we're going to add, so modifiers, mirror modifier. So modifier, mirror. And that will mirror the mesh so that we can continue to edit, and it will be mirrored across the avatar, so we don't really need to do too much. So we use our tools again, edge, extrude that upwards, and again. What we can also do in the mirror modifier, we want these vertices to snap the center line. So what we can do is enable clipping. And then when we move that vertex, it'll snap to the center line. So we'll just do some basic editing. So this is a large surface area. So we want to add a loop cut across there. And again, because we've got the mirror modifier, it's replicated across. Let's just change the distribution a little bit. So we're trying to even out so that's going to be our basic shape. So that's the front. What we can also do to make this easy to work with, let's switch to Material Preview. Material Properties. Click on the Browse to, there's the base material. Add that, assign it. We can change the color if we want. But what we want to do here is scroll all the way down to the bottom and enable backface culling. This helps us determine or see at a glance which way around the mesh is facing, because we're going to duplicate this and then flip it to the back. So we only need to select the active side, because obviously we have the mirror modifier enabled. So select, mesh, duplicate, escape to release, drag that across, hold Control to snap to the grid. And of course, the faces are the wrong way around at the back because we've duplicated the front. So all we need to do is go into Mesh, Normals, and then Flip. And this will invert the faces so they face outwards from the back, like so. And then of course we need to do some adjustments because this is the back of the mesh. Leave that as is. Make that a little bit wider. Like so. Let's save this actually at this point. So we'll assume that this is our basic mesh. This is our basic clothing item, or what will be the clothing item using the cloth sim. So let's just save this file, save as number 3. Now to get this to work within the context of cloth simulation, we need to stitch or connect, link, whatever word you want to use. We need to link the front and the back together, and we do that by using stitches. So again, it's the same metaphor that Marvelous Designer uses, but it's not quite as user-friendly, intuitive. So we select our vertexes, and then from the vertex menu we click on New Edge Face from Vertices. So Vertex, New Edge Face from Vertices. So the shortcut key for this is F. I'm going to be using this quite a bit for these. So F, that will create an edge connecting the vertexes. And we do this along each side or edge where a seam, as would be for clothing, a seam needs to appear. And again, because we've got the mirror modifier assigned, it'll duplicate it to the other side of the mesh. So we want a connection between the front and the back in the middle of the shoulder, and the same sort of thing down the side of the mesh. So we'll use this as our base mesh object. Back into object mode. Let's save this. It's a good idea to do this quite frequently. Do version saves working on these types of projects because this is very fiddly. Save as. So what we need to do next is apply the cloth sim to this object and then set up the properties for that cloth sim to then interact with the collision that we set previously. So select our object. We want to go into modifiers, add modifier, cloth. So physics cloth. So that will give us a little panel that tells us that we need to go into the physics tab, and that is the physics properties tab. So we've now got cloth highlighted as the type of simulation. So what we can do here is run the simulation without doing any settings, just so that we can see what happens, and then we can edit the properties and rerun the simulation. So the way that we do that is pressing the space bar or clicking the play button. And when we do this initially, the cloth just falls off the avatar. It's not affected or influenced by the mesh, the avatar mesh. So we can use these controls to toggle back and forth along the simulation, because the simulation is essentially an animation sequence or a timeline sequence that's set to end at 250 frames. So by the time the timeline scrubber gets to the end here, the simulation is essentially done, and that gives us our outcome. But as we saw, the cloth or the fabric, or what would be the fabric, just falls to the ground. So we need to change the properties for that. So once we've done a simulation, we use the jump to endpoint button just to return back to frame 1. So the basic properties that we want to use are all set in the physics panel. So the first one, we want to set the mass of our cloth. So we want to raise that a little bit. Let's go with 2.5. These are okay. We don't need to worry about stiffness or damping. Internal spring, don't need to worry about pressure. Expand shape, and here are the properties that we need. The main properties. What we want is sewing, so enable that. And then we want to set max sewing force. So this is the attraction, essentially, between the two halves of the mesh. So if we run the simulation with just these settings enabled, so click the play button, and we'll get a different outcome from the initial test that we did. So if we stop the simulation, we can move the timeline scrubber to 250 to get our final clothing appearance from our simulation. So sewing, or the max sewing force, is the attraction between the front and back. So if we change this to 10, run the simulation again, We can sometimes get different results, but how effective this is depends on how much mesh we've got available for shaping around our object. So right now, because we're low resolution and the mesh is quite tight, that's affecting the sewing between the surfaces. So what we can do to address that is stretch out our mesh. Stretch that out a little bit. Run the simulation again. And we can now see that we've got a tighter join along the seams. So that's our basic simulation. So those are our two basic properties to get this to function. Vertex mass, which basically defines how heavy the cloth is, and the shape properties, so we want sewing, which defines connection between our surfaces using our edges, our threads between vertices. What we might also want to enable is collisions. So if we activate that for more complex projects, this will determine, and self-collision, this will determine how the clothing item or the physics simulation interacts with itself. So for very complex clothing items where they are interacting with each other, so long voluminous sleeves, for example, that might interact with the chest, or ruffles that might interact with the arms. So we can enable the collision properties and edit those to change the behavior of our fabric. So once we've got our simulation, we can then start editing the mesh to add in more structure to increase the accuracy of the simulation. So we need to revert back to frame 1, and then we can do some basic editing, switching to edit mode and continuing to edit the mesh. So Control R loop cut, that's the front, and then we'll need to replicate the same loop cuts on the back as on the front. And then what we need to do, join these new vertices with our new thread, so the F key, select our vertices, F. So we're essentially creating a thread between these new vertices. Then we can redo the simulation. So object mode. And we can see already that it's starting to shape more accurately to the torso. Back to the start point. We always have to return to 0 before running the simulation again. And we could say that that is our clothing item. So let's just save this file, save as 5. So just to recap, once we've got the basic mesh shape, so this is our clothing template essentially. Again, we always start with a very basic shape, a very basic structure. Keep it simple and add detail as you progress once the settings are in place. So, just to recap, once we've got our object, our core settings, once we've assigned the cloth modifier, so the cloth modifier, physics properties, so check to make sure that cloth is enabled. Our basic properties are to set physical properties of the mesh itself, so that physically how heavy our cloth is. So vertex mass. In shape, we want to set sewing, which stitches the sides together, and the max sewing force. And then optionally we can set collision. So the two are physics properties and shape properties. And then all we do to run the simulation, click on the play button, let that run through to 250 frames. And then if we click drag the slider to frame 250, we get the end result. And then if we are re-rendering the simulation, we always have to return to frame 1 and then click on play button again. Let it run through the 250 frames. Stop. So frame 1 is our start position, 250 is our end point. So let's say that this is our clothing item. This is what we were wanting. The next step would be to convert this into a workable mesh that we can then bind to the avatar armature and then export and get into IMVU. So the way that we do this, make sure our mesh is selected. Modifier properties. We need to apply the mirror modifier first and then the cloth simulation. So click on the More Options button, apply the mirror modifier, and then apply the cloth simulation. So what we might want to do before we actually do that is just rerun the simulation one more time to make sure that we have a simulation that takes into account the entire physicality of the object, because the mirror modifier mirrors left to right, front to back, depending on which way the object is being mirrored, but we don't want that. We want the mesh to be unique relative to the entire avatar. And then once we've got that, apply modifier. So now we have a fully editable mesh. So we can now select each side independently of the other and edit the mesh. So this no longer affects our object. So let's just save this file, save as 6. When you do some basic editing, tidy up the mesh a little bit. Join parts together. So select our vertices, mesh, merge, and then we want at center in this case. So mesh, merge, at center. Shortcut key, again because we have to do this quite a bit, is the M key, M for Marty. Because it won't always have collapsed our edges. Alternatively, a quicker way to do this might be switching to wireframe. Alt select an edge, Alt select an edge, press the S key, scale, then the Y key to lock the axes, and then 0 to collapse. Confirm, and what that does is it collapses the selection to 0, so it collapses it all together. So we can do the same thing on the other side. Alt click, Shift Alt click, S for scale, Y to lock the axis, then 0 to collapse. Left click to set. Do that on the top. Might be a bit easier to see this on this selection. So that's our edges selected. S, Y, and then 0. Click to set. And then what we can do, select all, then we can use mesh, clean up, merge by distance. That'll give us the merge by distance pop-up. We can increase the value a little bit, which will capture all the vertexes based on their distance from one another. Just check. And everything's done. So that is our mesh ready to be prepped. So let's just save this again. Select our mesh, object, shade smooth. That'll smooth out our mesh. And then we can start the prep. So we want 2 materials, one for the back, one for the front. So we've already got one material assigned. So material properties. Let's just call this front. So front, space, square brackets, 0, close square brackets. Edit mode, face select, and we'll select the back. We can use circle select. So press the C key, C for Charlie, and that'll allow us to just do some quick paint selection. So those are our faces. I'm going to create a new material. Click New. Give this a different color. Rename square brackets 1, and then click the Assign button. This will assign this material to the selection. So now we have a front and a back. And this will come in handy because it makes UV unwrapping easier. So before we do that, we just want to go into Shading Workspace, finish up the materials. So there's our basic material. We want to add texture, image texture. So add texture, image texture. Create new. Front, we don't need to bother with the numerical append. Width 256 by 512. Generated type, so this is just going to be our temporary image. Color grid, OK. Then click drag, connect that up. So that's assign that to the back for some reason. So material properties, because we had back selected. So we'll call this, rename this back. Select the front, same again, add texture, image texture. New front. It'll keep the properties we used previously. Color grid, OK. Click drag. There's the front. Let's preview. So, UV mapping. So, UV editing workspace. Switch to material preview just so that we can see what we're doing. Material properties, this just helps us with the selection process because make sure nothing is selected. Select our material and then we're going to click select and deselect. We're going to use deselect and select. So that's going to select our UVs, and this is the default UV that was originally the plane that's now just been subdivided, because that's essentially all we did to the surface was just subdivide it. So it's kept that UV, that original UV assigned to the object, and just subdivided it. So now that we've got our selection, UV or UV, so we can use the UV menu in the UV editor or the 3D view, and unwrap, unwrap. So we're going to unwrap the UVs for this, and that'll unwrap it, and we can just do some basic manipulation. So we're going to go into island selection and use our widget tools to move and manipulate this. Hold control to snap, move, and then scale. What we can do to make this a little easier is use the UV editing widget, which gives us a little bit more user-friendly widget that we can use. So that's the front. Deselect. Select the back material. Click select. Again, there's our UVs. UV unwrap. That's the UV. We're in island select. Rotate. And then manipulate. So move, rotate, scale. So that is our UV map. So that's our UV maps done. What we can do before we go back to layout, UV, export UV layout. So this will export the texture map to aid painting our clothing item, the textures for our clothing. So UV, export UV layout. This is back. PNG, fill opacity, set that to 1. PNG, export UV layout. Deselect, select front, UV, export layout. That's okay. And we can also, whilst we're here, save the images. So we've got back set as the image that we were using. So save it, image, save as, back PNG. If we're using PNG, just remove the compression so that we're dealing with as much raw data as we can get. And then just save. Select the front, so browse to, we use the browse button as our front image. It's exactly the same, but save as, front, no compression. So we've now got images associated with our materials, so actual images, and this helps with export later on. So now that we've got that, back to layout, and then we can continue with the setup for IMVU. So let's just save. Now for this we want to weight the mesh, our clothing mesh, to the avatar skeleton. The easiest way to do that, depending on the type of clothing that we've made, is to copy the weights or duplicate the weights from the base avatar across to the clothing item. But because of the way that this works, what we want to do is do all the body parts at the same time. Otherwise, what will happen is that when we use the tool to do this, it'll copy the weights for one section, and then when we try and copy the weights for the other section, this will override the original weights. So we want to try and do them all at the same time. So the best way to do this is to select the avatar parts that we're going to copy, duplicate them, press escape just to reset, move those across out of the way, join them together. So this is a single uniform mesh. Edit mode, select all, and then from the mesh menu we want to clean up and merge by distance. So we need to remove any edges, hard edges or hard breaks in the mesh. This ensures that all the weight values that are going to be duplicated across are correctly set up. So back into object mode, move our clothing item across to the item that we're copying the weights from, and then what we want to do, modifiers, add modifier. What we want here is data transfer. We're going to set the source, so we'll use the eyedropper, mouse over the avatar that we are copying the data from, so that's our avatar. That'll set that as the source, and then what we want to do is enable vertex data, expand the options, vertex groups. Before we do this, actually, we can just double check this. So select our mesh, object data properties. We can see that there are no vertex groups associated with this mesh, but there are with the avatar. So essentially what we're doing is copying this data from the avatar onto the vest or clothing item, and that will copy the groups and the associated weight values. So that's what's actually going on. So vertex groups enable that, and we'll note that the mapping is the nearest vertex. So even though this works and it will do what's needed to be done, the accuracy of it is defined by the density of the mesh and the correspondence of that structure to the underlying avatar. So the closer the clothing item is to the avatar's structure, the better the transference between the two. So keep that in mind. So all we then need to do is just click the Generate Data Layers. That will generate the data. We can go into Object Data Properties, and there are all the groups copied across. And we can double check this by enabling Weight Paint mode. So we can either click on the button in the toolbar, or we can do it the traditional way. Weight Paint, change the mode that way. But either way, what this does is then mean that we can click on the groups and we can see how well they've been transferred across. And as with all modifiers, what we then need to do, so go back into modifier properties, we need to apply this modifier so that the data is locked into this mesh. So as with the other modifiers, more options, apply. What we should find now is we can move that across to our actual avatar and bind this manually, adding an armature modifier. So we're in modifiers again, add modifier. What we want is an armature modifier. Set the object, so click the eyedropper and then select or click on the skeleton. So if we just cancel that for the moment, select the skeleton and just toggle into pose mode. If we just move this, we can see that the avatar moves, but the clothing item doesn't. Even though the groups do exist on our clothing mesh, so again we can either use the pose button or pose mode, and that will toggle between our modes. So if we now set this up, eyedropper, skeleton, don't need to do anything else. Select skeleton, pose mode. Now find our clothing item moves with the mesh. And again, the accuracy of all of this depends on the density of the mesh and how well the data has transferred from the avatar to our object. So if we use bind to armature when we use this approach to setting up our clothing items, bind to armature will override whatever values are associated with the mesh. So for accuracy, particularly with complex clothing items, it's best to use the data transfer modifier and then copy that across vertex group data from the duplicated avatar to our clothing item. And then we can literally Let's just save this before we do. Export this as a clothing item. And for that, all we do is click on the export button. So that's given us an FBX that we can now import into Studio. So in Studio, we need to create a new project and then select the derivable that we're deriving from. So in this case, it's men tops empty male top. So select, derive. There's our avatar based on our inventory settings. All we need to do is just import the FBX. So import FBX, find the file, it'll be prepended clothing there it is, prepended depending on what tools used, so clothing in this case, clothing, open, so it's only going to bring in one mesh. We'll just bring this in just for now. So let's set this up as a top. Everything else is okay, we don't need to change anything here. Next, front, back, it's got our materials. Next, review, that's what it's bringing in. Import. What we should find is missing the torso. So depending on the clothing item that we are exporting, in this case because it's a vest, we need to include that missing part of the torso. So for that we need to go back into Blender, select the body part that needs to be included and the clothing item, and then click export. So if we now re-import that mesh into Studio, so let's create a new project, create, same again, empty male top, derive, there's our avatar based on our inventory settings again, so import FBX, find the file, there it is, open. It's now got two meshes. So setup FBX. So it's picked up on the fact that we have an upper body part. So our plane, which is our top, we can give that an arbitrary mesh ID. Next. So it's now got front and back, and it's also picking up on the skin material of the avatar. So next, that's what it's bringing in. Import, and it'll do the same thing, bringing in our clothing item and the torso. But this is missing a texture. So, component, make sure the skin material is selected, and then from the asset selection we need to set skin. Preview, and there is the skin. So that is essentially the basics of using the toolkit to create a clothing item based on the cloth simulation, so it replicates Marvelous Designer. The results may vary, obviously, depending on the design of the clothing item that's being made and the body parts that that item covers. But that is the basic process of using the cloth sim. Obviously we can save the file, do all the bits that we need for info, our product info, set our properties, and then submit to the catalogue.